We are learning a Sicha from Chelik Tesvav Likkutei Sichos on Parshas Vayeitzei. As before, we're using the English volume, the English translation by Sichos in English, selections from Likkutei Sichos. It's the in Chelik Tesvav. It's the fourth Sicha of Chelik Tesvav, and the Rebbe over here in the Sicha is going to speak about the idea of the focus is mainly in this week's Parsha about Yaakov's dealing with sheep, and it all surrounds the idea of sheep. Obviously, if we have one of the Avos, in some ways he's the primary one of the Avos, and he's the actual head of Klal Yisrael and established all the Shvatim, being the one that's dealing with sheep, and in such immense detail, the idea of sheep must be very important in a spiritual sense as well, including also the different details that the Sikha is going to point out that took place with Yaakov and his sheep. So we're going to be reading all on the English side of the page. This week's Torah reading elaborates upon the description of the life of Yaakov Avinu, our patriarch, in the house of Lavan, relating how he devoted himself principally to tending sheep. Not only did he work as a shepherd, but ultimately Lavan paid him with sheep. So it wasn't just the working hours of the day he was involved in being a sheep herder, but also his wealth and his accumulation of payment and wealth, as the Torah explains, was all based on sheep. So really his entire livelihood, both his work and what he was paid in kind, involved sheep. Thus, Yaakov's property consisted primarily of sheep, and from them he became wealthy. Like it says, Vayifrei tzaish ma'od ma'od, Vayhi tzoin rabbis, and the man became prodigiously successful. He acquired fertile sheep, and they became a source of wealth for him. And he exchanged these sheep for, it says afterwards, shvaches, v'abodim, gmalim, v'chamoidim. He changed them for maidservants, camels, and donkeys. As Rashi comments, he would sell his sheep at a high price and purchase all of the above. So, after all is said and done, sheep were the mainstay. Sheep were the core where his wealth and success was both based on and came from. Nevertheless, as related in Parshas Vayishlach, when Yaakov instructed his agents to convey a message to Esav, he describes his property in the following order. Even though sheep was his primary preoccupation in our Parsha, it says, I have acquired oxen and donkeys, Vayhili shoy v'chamoir. Then he said, soin, sheep, and then the Eved v'shivcha v'goymer, and servants and maidservants, etc. He mentions sheep after oxen and donkeys, and not as his first and primary acquisition. In particular, this represents a change from the wording in another verse, in another pasuk, which relates that when Yaakov fled from Lavan, he led away first all of his herds, v'yinaheg es kol miknehu, and only then aves kol rechushay, and all of his property, what he had purchased with his herds. So in other words, it comes out that when Yaakov is like talking about him, what the Torah is talking about Yaakov himself, it talks about the herds of sheep. But when, for some reason, when Yaakov is communicating to Esav, sheep is not primary, not the first thing that's mentioned. So this next paragraph, the Rebbe says, every concept in the Torah is an eternal lesson for every Yid in every place and every time. This applies in particular regarding the actions of the Avos, the patriarchs, which are related in the Torah. And how much more so does this apply regarding a concept that fills almost an entire Torah reading. The story about Yaakov Avinu and his sheep and being at Lavan is almost the sole discussion and the sole topic in our parsha and Parshas Vayeitzei. Such narratives certainly are assigned to their descendants, like it says, Maaseh Avos Siman Labanim. The actions of the forefathers are a sign for the descendants. And like the Rebbe always emphasizes, it doesn't just mean a sign as an indicator of what's going to take place, but it's more than that. It's also a nesinas koyach. It's also empowering the descendants of Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov to carry out their appropriate divine service. Relevant lessons for the spiritual service of every Jew can be derived from the following particulars involving Yaakov's work with sheep. He's going to go on and explain that there's actually something even more over here to be considered. Not just the idea that he worked with sheep, but the following specifics about his work with sheep. A, specifically sheep enabled him to become prodigiously successful. What was the source of his wealth? The sheep. B, although his primary property was sheep, he nevertheless exchanged a portion of his sheep, and the Rebbe will even explain later in the Sikha the significance that only a portion of it was exchanged, not all of it, for maidservants, servants, camels, and donkeys. C, regarding his mission to Esav, he mentioned sheep after oxen and donkeys. So the Rebbe goes on to explain that the above concepts can be clarified by prefacing an explanation of the description of a Jew's bond with Hashem found in the Medrash. The Medrash says, Huli la'av ani lo leben. He is my father and I am a son to him. Huli l'roya, he is for me a shepherd, va'ani lo l'tzayin, and I am his sheep. This is similar to the davening that we have on Yom Kippur, that we have the similar type of enumeration of the different means and types of relationships we have with Hashem. So the Rebbe poses and brings up a well-known question on this type of relationships that the Medrash enumerates. There's a well-known question regarding this teaching. Since the Jews are compared to God's sons, what is added by comparing them to sheep? On the contrary, how can the manner in which a shepherd cherishes sheep be compared to the manner in which a father cherishes a son? The love of a parent to a child is much more powerful and greater and stronger and much more essential to the nature of the father and the son than the relationship between a shepherd and their sheep. As loving and as devoted as the sheep might be to the shepherd and the shepherd is to the sheep, but it's only a relationship of a human being to an animal. The explanation given is that this is precisely the significant factor. This is exactly what it's all about. This type of relationship of the sheep is very, very significant over here. The fact that the Jews are called sons shows that they are an independent entity with regard to their relationship with their father Hashem. As soon as you say the word son, son indicates there are two people over here, two individuals. A son has to respect his father, etc., but it's still, the son has become, once he's born, separated and independent of their parents, and that's eventually where they're headed. True, there's different levels of independence, but even as soon as they're born, they're independent, and then they completely grow into a completely independent being. True, the bond between a Jewish soul and Hashem does not resemble the bond between a father and a son on this physical plane. For in that instance, the son has become a separate entity from his father, while the soul is entirely one with God and is not separate from him at all. Even once Hashem created the Jewish people, we are still called a chelik elokam mimal. We are still one with Hashem. Nevertheless, using the analogy of a son implies that it is as if the soul is an independent entity and is not the father. And its existence and cherished quality, the fact that the son is beloved by the father, has value and significance for the father. Meaning that the way a father loves a son is because the son has value in the world of the father. He has significance in the world of the father. Such a relationship can be relevant only regarding the divine light that encloses itself in the spiritual cosmos. In Chassidus, the term is used Seder Hishtalshelus, the level of light that serves as a source for the created beings. The souls are significant on that level of existence. When we're dealing with a godly divine energy that has to do and is connected with the world, where the world bears some type of existence and has some type of being to it, so then it's possible to say that there is a relationship of a father and a son, where there's an independent being that's connected with Hashem. However, with regard to the godly light that transcends the spiritual cosmos, concerning a godly light that's totally beyond Seder Ishtalshelos, the level of which it says he has neither son nor brother. It says, it's a pasuk in Kehelos that says Hashem has no son, that Egam Bein ve'ach ein loy. So in such a level that's completely transcendent, it is not relevant to speak of any existence outside of Hashem's own being, his own being. With regard to this level, the Jewish people and their cherished quality, in other words, how they are beloved by Hashem, are compared to sheep. For sheep and their cherished quality have no significance in the relation to the essence of the shepherd. Meaning, a sheep is an animal, and being that's an animal, its state of bittul, its state of nullification, is a complete one. So when we're dealing with Hashem's divine entity, the way it completely transcends everything, so over there, the level of a sheep is indicating more that relationship that we have to Hashem, because we are this distance and this nullification and sublimation is similar to the distance and sublimation that a sheep would have. However, this is also a sign of the unique nature of the Jewish people, that even on the level of godliness, where there is no place for the existence of created beings, he has neither son nor brother, the Jews are nevertheless cherished. This is an amazing thing. On the one hand, we're talking about the great bittul. On the other hand, we're saying that despite how high and how removed Hashem is, we still have a connection with him, that he loves us in that state. But in what type of degree is that love and relationship? On this level, however, the Jews' cherished quality, in other words, the fact that they are beloved by Hashem, comes not because of their identity, who they are, and the virtues they possess, but on the contrary, because of their transcendence of their identity and the awesome bittul to Hashem that they display. This bittul, this sublimation, this nullification is a medium for the divine light that transcends the spiritual cosmos. What is the means to reach godliness on such a level? On a level that's completely beyond everything? That's only a bittul. When we have a complete bittul, that is when we can connect to God's transcendent level. As it is written, Morim v'kodesh eshkoin, I dwell with the lofty and the holy ones, v'esdako shval ruach, and with those who are crushed and humble of spirit. In other words, how can we, who are not necessarily on our own lofty and holy ones, connect with Hashem's essence, the essence that's completely removed, the transcendent level of Hashem, higher than Seder Ishtalshelos? It's because of my humility, which is signified by the level of sheep. So sheep enables us to be able to connect with Hashem on this loftiest of all levels, the level of godliness that transcends Seder Ishtalshelos. This concept, the awesome bittul exhibited by the Jewish people, is alluded to by the comparison of Jews to sheep. For as we see in actual life, sheep possess the quality of bittul more than other animals. So therefore, This answers the question that we had on the Medrash. Why does the Medrash, what benefit is there to compare our relationship to Hashem like sheep to a shepherd when we already have the relationship of a child to a father? Because a child to a father is still a relationship based on qualities and independence and so on. Whereas the relationship of a sheep to a shepherd is based on bittul, which is the means through which a yid connects to Hashem's essence that's higher than Seder Ishtalshlus. So now, based on this, we're going to be able to understand the idea of translating this into the service of Hashem. In the service of Hashem, we have a service that is sheep-like, and we have a service that is not sheep. It's not about sheep. So he says the idea that's not about sheep. These two analogies for the Jewish people, the sons and sheep, allude to two modes in man's service of Hashem, divine service. The level of sons relates to Torah study. This service focuses on intellectual understanding and comprehension. In this mode of service, the person studying feels significant. After all, he is grasping the Torah through his own powers of comprehension. So this is something like a child that we said before, that the child is one that has this idea of being an entity for himself, something independent, something that can have something that could be completely and totally of his own nature. I understand, I comprehend. For a person's study to focus on the true intent of the Torah, Hashem's wisdom, his study must be characterized by bittul. True, the Rebbe says there must be a foundation of bittul for one to be able to really grasp what Hashem is trying to say. Only through the approach of what it says, V'nafshi ka'ofer lakol tiyah, we say this in every davening and every Shemoneh Esrei at the end, that let my soul be as dust to all. Is it possible for Hashem to fulfill the psach libi b'soresecha, to open my heart to your Torah? In other words, it must be founded on the idea of complete bittul to Hashem. It has to be a complete state of bittul, and then once we have a complete state of bittul, then we can learn Torah the way we're supposed to. And we can grasp Hashem's Torah. As explained regarding the positive effect of reciting the blessings before Torah study, that the reason why we recite a bracha before learning Torah is to have us imparted in us the awareness and the idea that the Eibishter is the one that's in charge, that it's the Torah of Hashem, it's Hashem's mind, it's Hashem's wisdom, and it's nothing other than Hashem's wisdom. So then he says further after the parentheses, nevertheless, this bittul serves only as a foundation preparation for Torah study. Torah study is not about bittul. Torah study is about using my mind, but it needs to be based on a foundation of bittul. The Torah study itself, however, must be carried out not with bittul, but on the contrary, with the power of intellect. On the other hand, sheep serve as an analogy for the divine service of refining the world at large. In Chassidus terminology, there's Torah versus birudim. There's Torah versus refining the sparks. What does it mean, the idea that sheep has to do with refining the sparks? Tzoyin, the Hebrew word tzoyin you could see, Hebrew for sheep relates to the word yitzia. As you can see in the Hebrew, they're the same, practically the same letters of tzei, tzadik aleph. Hebrew for sheep, departure, going out from the realm of Torah, what the Rebbe calls the Daled Ames Shel Torah, and occupying oneself with worldly affairs to transform them into a dwelling place for Hashem in the lower realms, to make a dira for Hashem betachtoinim. When a person has this type of going out of himself, he leaves himself behind, he has bittul, in other words, so then he involves himself with the mission, with refining and elevating the world. This path of divine service expresses a Jew's bittul to Hashem, how he goes beyond his personal existence, tzoin, going out of himself. For he does not perform this divine service for himself to reach personal fulfillment or to attain spiritual heights. That's not the purpose over here. If he wants to be about himself, he'd be doing things for his own mind, for his own intellect, and so on. Indeed, on the contrary, the involvement with worldly matters is a descent for him. He must interrupt the study of Torah, in which he invests the highest and most refined capacities of his soul. The intellect is one of the highest parts of the soul, and he needs to put that aside to do what? To be involved in Torah study, to be involved in going out into the world, and involve himself in matters of physical action. This service is performed only to carry out Hashem's purpose, the mission of Hashem, the kavanah of Hashem in the Yiddish, to make a dwelling for him in the lower realms, to make a dira lo yisbarach, a home for Hashem down here below. Based on the above, we can understand the connection between the concept of sheep and Yaakov's divine service in Lavan's home. There is a fundamental difference between Yaakov's divine service during the period described in Parshas Toldos and his avodas Hashem, his divine service, which is described in Parshas Vayeitzei. If you think about it, he's a completely different Yaakov. He's a completely different, involved in totally different types of activities. Parshas Toldos describes Yaakov's divine service as avodas Hashem in keeping with the analogy of a son. Over there, we see Yaakov as a child. What does that mean? He was involved in Torah study, which has to do with the connection of a child. He was an artless man, meaning Yaakov Ish Tom, dwelling in tents, Yoshev Oyalim, interpreted by our sages, as referring to the study in the tents of Shem and the tents of Aver. That's the multiple tents that he was dwelling in. Even the conclusion of the Torah reading, the end of last week's parsha, the end of Parshas Toldos, which relates that Yaakov had to flee from his father's house, did not mark a cessation of his connection with constant Torah study. On the contrary, he hid in the house of Aver for 14 years and studied Torah there. So you see this idea that Parshas Toldos is the ben type of service, an intelligent, intellectual pursuit involving a person's independence, like a son is independent from the father. The next parsha, our parsha, Vayeitzei literally means, and he went out. The whole parsha is called going out. Parshas Vayeitzei, by contrast, speaks about Yaakov's departure from the realm of Torah study and his arrival in Charan, which the Chazal say, Charan is related to the word charoin af, anger. That Chazal say, Charan is the focus of Hashem's anger in the world, as its name indicates. And while in Charan, Yaakov lived in the house of Lavan. There also he worked as a shepherd, in the simple sense of the word, serving Lavan with all of his might. B'chol koichi avadati, Yaakov Avinu describes it. Indeed, Yaakov's conduct serves as a model for the dedication that a worker must show his employer, that the halacha brings this evidence from what Yaakov did for Lavan as an example of how an employee must be totally devoted to an employer. And it was specifically this service which brought out the inner selfless commitment that characterized Yaakov. Despite the immense concealment and hiddenness of godliness he experienced in Lavan's home, Yaakov remained unaffected. Like he told Esav, he told him that in Lavan Garti, and the Chazal say, what does it mean Garti? Garti is from the word Taryag, 613. So from this, the Chazal say, I lived with Lavan and I observed the 613 mitzvahs. And there he established his family, the Shiftei Ka, the tribes of Hashem, in a manner concerning which our sages commented, his bed progeny meaning was perfect. Mitase Shlema, meaning all of his children were complete and perfect. This divine service brought forth the ultimate bittul of Yaakov. The ultimate level and bittul of Yaakov was expressed in the Yaakov service in the house of Lavan. This is the inner reason why the primary property which Yaakov earned and took with him from the house of Lavan was sheep. For sheep alludes to the spiritual peak which he attained through the divine service in the house of Lavan, the quality of bittul, as explained above, to leave himself behind, to enter into an entirely different environment, to be able to elevate the sparks that had to be elevated. This is also alluded to by the expression that says, Vayeitzei ish ma'od ma'od. In English, the man became prodigiously successful. The word paratz, the root of the word vayifreitz, translated as became successful, literally means broke through, alluding to the inner strength required to break through barriers and overcome limitations. For through bittul, identified with sheep, one can overcome all the limits of the spiritual cosmos of Seder Ishtalshlus and approach the divine light, the Oir Eliki, that has no limitations. Because to reach that, we said, you can only do that with a level of tzoyin. A person that's serving only as a ben cannot attain that level that's higher than Seder Ishtalshlus. This is alluded to by the words also that says, Ma'oid ma'oid. It says, Vayeitzei ish ma'oid ma'oid. Translated as prodigiously, ma'oid, which alludes to an unlimited quality, is repeated. In general, Chassidus explains ma'oid, which means very much so, is above and beyond. Ma'oid ma'oid means way above beyond anything. So he broke through the glass ceiling. He broke through the highest, most levels. Why? Because his avodah was in the way of tzayin, of going out of himself, complete bit. The sequence the sequence continued until, as reflected in the Chassidic and positively oriented interpretation of the verses, he changed my wages 10 times. Yaakov was saying about Lavan, "Vehechlif es maskurti aseres moinim." If he said the spotted ones will be your wages, all the flocks would bear spotted ones. If he said ringed ones will be your wages, all the animals would bear ringed ones. But the main point is that Lavan kept on changing the contract. We made one contract, he saw it wasn't good for him, he changed the contract, he broke this deal, he broke that deal. That, the simple meaning is, this was a very bad thing, because Lavan kept on taking advantage of Yaakov and breaking his deals with Yaakov. But in truth, in Chassidus, in the inner meaning of it, this was actually a very great indication of how powerful and how high Yaakov reached. Yaakov drew down the essential will of the source of emanation. He drew down a level that's called in Chassidus Atzmus Ratzon HaMaitzil. That level is so transcendent, this level of godliness is above any division or form. Hence, his wages were continually able to change from one form to another. In other words, form indicates limitation. And these different types of descriptions of animals, Chassidus connect with different levels of godliness. Yaakov Avinu reached so high because of his bittul that the changes could constantly take place. He wasn't locked into one particular thing. He wasn't stuck with within one particular area. It was all the divine will shining through everything. So he goes on further that the divine service, part 6, the divine service of a son which is dependent on one's understanding and comprehension. In other words, qualities associated with one's personal identity must also be carried out in a manner of bittul. So here the Rebbe says as follows. It's not that these two types of avodas live apart. I learn Torah, then I close the book, and I go out into the world and do birurim and refine and go out of myself and elevate the world. No. Each one must inform and impact the other. As stated above. So we have to make sure that even when we're studying Torah, there has to be the level of bittul as well. It needs to be permeated with bittul as well. As we said, he studies Torah, and the Torah is under the premise of nafshika afla kol tiyah, that his soul is like dust before all. In a similar vein, similarly, the divine service of sheep, which is characterized primarily by bittul, must also bring into expression all of the powers of one's soul, even those associated with one's personal identity. In other words, the purpose over here is not just completely nullifying and losing my existence, but there has to be that the bittul of sheep, the bittul of tzayin, permeates all my other powers. And every other power and capability of my soul does not become lost, but rather I use all my gifts and all the powers of my soul infused with bittul. To the contrary, bittul and self-effacement alone are not sufficient to combat the concealment and hiddenness of God in the world. It's necessary to be able to take on the world. You need to relate to the world. It's not just enough to approach it with bittul. You need to take that bittul and bring it into worldly activities. Instead, it is necessary to follow the directive found in the very beginning of the Torah in the Shulchan Aruch. It says, "Havi az kanomer goimer and gibar kari, be bold as a leopard and valiant as a lion." We must use the quality of boldness, not to be embarrassed when confronted by scoffers, like it says, and the quality of valor to overcome lisgaber al yitzroi, to overcome one's evil inclination, and lenatzcha kigibar amizgaber al soine lenatzcha lapil la'aretz, and conquer it like a mighty man who overcomes his adversary, vanquishing him and throwing him to the ground. However, with regard to this service of valor, it must be clarified that one must act as a result of his bittul to Hashem's will. Here the Rebbe makes a very important condition and a qualifier. Yes, one must be bold, but the boldness must have an underlying awareness and feeling of bittul. For if his valor comes as a result of his own yeshus, self-concern, focused on himself, his ego, it will be the opposite of holiness. And if it's the opposite of holiness, accordingly such conduct cannot serve as the proper resource to combat those who scoff and oppose the Torah and its mitzvahs. One can only fight the negativity by bringing the positive and the holy to bear. And if a person's boldness is not anchored in bittul, so then there's ego, there's yeshus, there's not kedusha, and you don't have the power to overcome the unholiness and impurity. Another problem, the Rebbe says, if you are just going to attack klippa, the negative forces, with your ego and your boldness, not anchored in bittul, not based in bittul. So the Rebbe says, in addition, when one fights using the strength of his personal existence, he may not be victorious in battle. For the opposing side, in other words, over here the klippa, may well be fortified with a greater amount of that type of boldness. So I'm going to bring boldness to the table, but I have no idea the other one's boldness may be greater. If instead a person exhibits boldness because the Torah commanded him to, his boldness and valor can vanquish any opponent. One can possibly explain that this is the inner reason why the Tur and the Alter Rebbe in the Shulchan Aruch also quote the name of the author of that statement, Yehuda ben Tema. The whole Shulchan Aruch is a compendium of halachis in short. It is not there to point out who said it. You open up any part of Shulchan Aruch, it says the halacha, what you have to do, this is what you have to do on Shabbos, this is what you have to do in a business deal, this is what you have to do in marriage, this is what you have to do in keeping kosher. It doesn't say Rabbi Yossi said this, Rabbi Meir said this. But at the beginning of Shulchan Aruch, what does he start off with? Yehuda ben Tema Omer. Why does he have to begin with the words Yehuda ben Tema? What significance is there that all of a sudden, exceptionally and out of the ordinary for all the other halachas in Shulchan Aruch, does he introduce the author of the statement? So the Rebbe says this comes to allude to the fact that being bold as a leopard is appropriate only when it results from the approach alluded to by the name Yehuda ben Tema. What does the name Yehuda ben Tema mean? Yehuda reflects the divine service of Eidah, acknowledgement and bittul, like it says that Leah called Yehuda because Hapam Oides Hashem. I acknowledge Hashem, I nullify myself to Hashem, subordinating one's will to a higher authority. And in addition to that, that's the Yehuda part. What's the Ben Tema? Teaches that the approach of bittul cannot merely be a preface at the beginning of one's divine service. I start off, I have bittul, and then I totally engage in the doing whatever types of avodah of the ben. No, that's insufficient. Tema means say in Aramaic. The word tema in Aramaic means to say. The name Ben Tema, the son of Tema, implies that one's bittul must constantly be said, i.e. expressed. When one is bold as a leopard, even when the qualities of boldness and valor are as expressed as the Torah commands, one can easily slip into boldness and valor that stem from self-concern. It's a very thin partition between being bold because of holiness or being bold out of one's ego. How do I prevent that slipping down that slope? Therefore, it's a need for a constant reminder that one's bittul stems totally from Yehuda, one's valor, stems solely from Yehuda, i.e. bittul. And that is the idea of Ben Tema. He constantly needs to say this. He constantly needs to emphasize this and assure himself and to really put this into his mind and his thoughts and to his activities. Now, in 7, he's going to explain the details of this. Once we've explained the interrelationship between the difference between Tzayin and Ben, how each one has to have the other, now we're going to explain some of the questions that we had about how Yaakov spoke differently when he spoke to Esau, how he exchanged some of his sheep for other things. All of the above helps us understand that. On this basis, we can understand the particular points mentioned above regarding Yaakov's sheep. In other words, the specifics of it. First, we explained the general avoid of the sheep and how it must be done. Now, the details. Generally, Yaakov's divine service and therefore his property centered on sheep. Bittul, as explained above. That was the general approach of Yaakov. That was what Yaakov was all about. Like we said, his work was with sheep and his wealth was built on sheep. He was paid with sheep and he earned his pay through sheep. Nevertheless, he did not remain content with this. Instead, he included in his property maidservants, servants, camels, and donkeys. For in order to carry out the task of refinement as required, including also the refinement of Esau, whom he would confront later. So he needs to engage with the world, like we said. The bittul couldn't have stood apart. The bittul must manifest itself in the world. All the different types of divine service that are alluded to by these types of property were necessary. And Chassidus explains, and Torah Oyer explains specifically what Shoir and Chamoir and Avodim and Shivcha, all these things, what they are spiritually, the Rebbe doesn't go into it. But the point is, like we said before, the bittul of tzayin needs to manifest itself into everything else. Has to come into the other parts of the person's life, not just remain bittul alone and then doesn't have any connection with the world. But there needs to be a certain way how it is done. When including these other elements, however, two matters must be forewarned. A, Yaakov increased his property by acquiring the other assets through exchanging sheep. What does that indicate? This implies that they were not considered independent aspects of divine service, but an outgrowth of the divine service of Bittul. All these other types of a divine service, the camels, the oxen, the donkeys, etc., these all were an outgrowth of his bittul. They were permeated with and they were connected to his bittul. So even though they were other types of service, but they were service that had to do and was a result of bittul. Beis, even afterwards, once he already changed the tzayin for these other types of avoidus or these other types of animals, he did not exchange all of his sheep for other assets. On the contrary, even then sheep remained the main portion of his assets. For even when entering the battle against the concealment and hiddenness of Hashem within the world, where power and valor are necessary, in other words, Azo and Yizgaber Kari, then feelings of bittul must remain a fundamental quality. That is why the emphasis is on the fact that he exchanged it for the tzayin. These were all, he exchanged only some of it for the tzayin. He still had to hold on to some of his sheep to be able to have this type of connection of bittul, was even the major portion of his assets. So he continues now in 8. In light of the above, we can appreciate why Yaakov did not mention sheep first when sending messengers to Esav in next week's parsha, and he told them all that he acquired in the house of Lavan, like we mentioned earlier in the Sikha. Despite the fact that they represented his primary asset, wouldn't it make sense that if Yaakov is enumerating what was his assets, so he should go by what was most of his assets, and then from most of his assets going on to the lesser ones. Think of it maybe ingredients on a food item that's produced. Usually the first ingredient is the most that's made up of. The first ingredient of Yaakov's wealth was the tzayin. Why, when he was speaking to Esav, did he put tzayin further down? So he's saying, by saying, I have acquired oxen and donkeys, sheep, servants, and maidservants. Vayili, Shoyer, V'chamor, V'tzayin, V'avad, V'shivcha. Yaakov was telling Esau of his spiritual assets, the merits and lofty powers that would sustain him in his imminent confrontation with Esau. As we know, just like when he told him, Im Lovan Garti, why did he tell them Im Lovan Garti? And the Chazal say that means Taryag Mitzvah Shamarti, I've observed the 613 mitzvahs. Because he was trying to show Esau in the spiritual battle where he's at. So even the rest of it, he was showing Esau in the spiritual, what was his avodah going on with the shoyer and the chamoyer and the tzayin, the evet, the shivcha, etc. In this way, he would frighten Esau and cause him to refrain from carrying out his designs, because bringing the spiritual forces of Kedusha to bear. For this reason, Yaakov did not mention sheep first. As mentioned above, sheep reflects the qualities of bittul, lowliness, and submission. And to frighten Esav, it was primarily necessary to have him first appreciate Yaakov's strength. So even though Yaakov's main thing was his bittul, and his strength grew out of his bittul, like we said, Yehuda ben Tema Oimer have a azkanemer, that the azkanemer is a result of Yehuda ben Tema. But Esav needn't see that he is he's a Nebuch, he's a Shmata, he's a Tzoin, he's a sheep. Esav needs to see the boldness of Yaakov. But he could know that the boldness, Esav must know that Yaakov owns sheep, i.e. that he's characterized by bittul. Hence, he will know that Yaakov's strength is not his own personal valor, but the strength of holiness, which is much more powerful, as we said before, than strength that's just based on boldness and valor. Nevertheless, with what do we frighten Esav? You got to talk to him out of a place of strength, with power. This, however, applies with regard to the qualities a person must show to impress his opponent. But for himself, he must know and remember the truth that his power is an extension of his bittul, and a Jew's primary resources are his sheep. So he says in 9, the above contains an obvious directive for our generation. We must follow the mode of divine service mandated by Vayeitzei, going out to the world at large and illuminating it. True, beforehand it is necessary to prepare oneself by studying Torah in the tents of Shem and Aver. But to attain the peak of, and the man became prodigiously successful, Vayifrei Ta'ish Ma'od Ma'od, i.e. filling up the land and conquering it, like Adam was told, Miluas Aretz V'Chivshua. One must go out to the world and occupy himself with illuminating it. It has to be the idea of Vayeitzei. On the contrary, in this era, this era of Ikvus the Mashiach, where Mashiach's approaching footsteps can be heard, the primary focus of our divine service is action. In the era of the Gemara, of the Talmud, of the Mishnah, Torah study was the primary focus. This is no longer true in the present age. Indeed, as reflected in the ruling of Shulchan Aruch, there is no one in the present age of whom it can be said, Torah Yumanase, his Torah is his sole occupation, as was the level of Reb Shimon ben Yochai and his colleagues. Not even a small percentage of the Jewish people are on that level, not because they are somehow less, but the mission is now in a different form. Because the fundamental divine service of the present era, the avodas Hashem that's demanded now, is action, performing acts of tzedakah. Tzedakah means going out of ourselves to help a Jew outside that doesn't have the knowledge of Yiddishkeit. In particular, this applies in the present generation when the efforts to find Jews blundering in the darkness of exile and bring them to the light of Torah and its mitzvahs must be carried out on the most basic level. We're not talking about very high levels. This is simply right in front of our eyes. We are not speaking about making a common person a scholar, to make a regular person into a Talmud Chacham, making a lesser scholar a greater scholar, or even making a person who is lax in his observance of mitzvahs a genuinely God-fearing individual. We are talking about actually saving lives of these people, that they should continue being Jewish, acting Jewish, continuing the chain of Jewish continuity. For when we act in this manner, we save the life of a Jew and thereby all of his descendants, ensuring that they remain Jewish and conduct themselves, at least regarding their actual maisim, their deeds, as a Jew must conduct himself. So he says in 10, to add another point, for a person's efforts to be crowned with success, they must be motivated by bittul. Like we said before, the tzoin indicates nullification. He must be dedicated to a higher purpose and carry out these activities for the sake of fulfillment of God's mission of illuminating the exile. I'm not doing it for my own aggrandizement. I'm not doing it for my own ego, because it makes me feel better to bring another Jew closer to Yiddishkeit. I must do it completely because this is the mission that Hashem wants to illuminate the world. When one carries out his mission with bittul, his efforts are not determined by the limits of his nature and personal satisfaction. He does not make that much difference to him where God sends him. Wherever God's providence, hashgacha pratis, directs him. Whichever people he comes into contact, he invests all of his power and all of his strength to raise up many students, like it says, Hamidu Talmidim Harbe, it says in Pirkei Avos, surpassing all boundaries and limits in a manner in which the man becomes prodigiously successful. Vayeitzei ish ma'od ma'od. So in other words, because he's doing it out of bittul, he doesn't think, does this come normally to me? Is this my natural inclination? Is this something that will bring me satisfaction? It's not about my satisfaction. It's not about who I am. And it's not about where I choose to be. It's the wherever Hashem has chosen me at this time to be, I need to fulfill this mission. When one proceeds with the attitude that one must carry out Hashem's mission, one is successful with all types of students. One doesn't say, this is not going to work out. This guy is not really a student the way it's supposed to be, etc., etc. No, makes no difference because my bittul to Hashem. To borrow the words from the Torah reading, if he said, Im koyoymar, the spotted ones will be your wages, nekudim yus chorecha. If he said, the ring ones, akudim yus chorecha, all the flocks would bear. What does that mean, all the flocks would bear? Over there that it says by Yaakov, i.e. all of the students grow up in the desired manner. If I have the bittul, so I don't have to worry, this guy maybe won't be such a great student because my approach is with bittul. Moreover, it says, the Chazal say that they are more fertile than other sheep. So because I'm doing it out of bittul, the students that I raise up will be even greater. Their bittul will enable them to produce many students. One's bed, mitase shleima, progeny is perfect. There are no flaws in one's offspring. In this case, just like Yaakov, there was no flaws in his children. This means in our case, there's no flaws in any of our students that we're trying to reach. This prepares each Jew and all Jews for the true and ultimate redemption. In this redemption, not one Jew will remain in exile as we have been promised. You, the children of Israel, will be gathered one by one, and a great congregation will return here. May this take place in the immediate future.